Almost every day, drones are used in this war, not as a novelty, not as a surprise. They have become routine, much like artillery in earlier conflicts, no longer treated as exceptional weapons, but as instruments of daily pressure. What often shocks the public is not the technology itself. It is the outcome. One drone, one strike, and a high-value asset is damaged or destroyed. This is usually where public attention stops, at the image, at the fire, and the assumption follows that something has failed. In reality, the situation is far more complex. The real question is not why one attack succeeded. It is why this war continues to be managed as if such outcomes could be completely prevented. Ukraine does possess air defense systems supplied by many countries. That is a fact. Patriot, NASAMS, IRIS-T, along with legacy Soviet systems still in service. On paper, they form a formidable network. In public discourse, this network is often portrayed as nearly flawless, as if the sky itself can be sealed, as if every threat can be intercepted. War does not operate according to narratives. Air defense systems always function on prioritization, not universal coverage, not total protection. The capital is prioritized over regional cities, political centers over logistical infrastructure, symbolic sites over everyday civilian needs. This is not malice, it is limitation. Yet at this point, the Ukrainian leadership often chooses to preserve an image of strength rather than openly acknowledge these limits. And when reality breaks through the narrative, what suffers is not only infrastructure, but public trust. Kamikaze drones are not designed for fair engagements. They are designed to impose cost. They fly low, slow, with a small radar signature. They force defenders into a dilemma. Intercept or ignore. Intercepting means expending expensive interceptors. Ignoring means accepting risk. Over time, this is not a technological issue. It is an economic one. Russia appears to understand this clearly, coldly, without rhetoric. Not every drone needs to hit its target. 1 out of 10 is enough. Sometimes 1 out of 20. This approach is not dramatic, but it is consistent. Ukraine, meanwhile, remains largely reactive, waiting, responding, consuming resources. Here, the difference is not moral, it is structural.
Ебать!
This war is not decided by a single decisive strike. It is decided by exhaustion, exhaustion of systems, exhaustion of logistics, exhaustion of psychology. Each day without structural resolution forces defenses to operate beyond their intended design. There is no spectacular collapse, only gradual erosion, slightly wider gaps, slightly thinner reserves, slightly more compromises. Russia seems to have accepted early on that long wars are not won through perfection, but through endurance. Ukraine, by contrast, remains bound to the language of rapid victory and the promise that the next delivery of aid will change everything. War does not wait for promises. At this stage, the war can no longer be explained solely through maps and weapons. It is about choices. The Ukrainian leadership faces a real dilemma. Ending the war would open fundamental questions. Questions about casualties, about territory, about past decisions. In many cases, leadership chooses the option safest for political survival. Continuing the war. Not because all alternatives have been exhausted, but because admitting limits is seen as too dangerous. Criticism is easily labeled. Doubt is framed as weakness. This is often where humanity is lost. When war is sustained, not for the population, but for the continuity of the political order itself. Beyond press conferences and military briefings, civilians live with the consequences. Unstable electricity, lost employment, a constant sense of insecurity. They do not debate geopolitics. They focus on survival. Ironically, civilian suffering is often used as narrative fuel rather than as a trigger for reassessment. Meanwhile, Russia's approach in areas it controls, while far from ideal, places greater emphasis on stabilization and long-term control. This is not unqualified praise. It is a comparison that must be acknowledged. When one side demands continuous sacrifice without a clear horizon and the other offers predictability, civilians draw their own conclusions. This video is not intended to pass judgment, nor is it meant to deliver a final verdict on history. History will decide that, slowly and often long after the consequences are irreversible. What matters now is reality as it exists today. A war sustained by leadership operating under clear and persistent limitations. Limitations that are known, repeated, and yet rarely addressed with honesty. This conflict is often framed as a test of will, values, or resolve. But wars are not won by slogans. They are not sustained by belief alone. They are sustained by logistics, by manpower, by economic capacity, and by the willingness of civilians to endure. Technology, no matter how advanced, does not eliminate arithmetic. Narratives, no matter how powerful, do not replace material constraints, and no external support can fully substitute for internal sustainability. At some point, continuing a war without reassessment stops being resistance and starts becoming inertia. The danger is not defeat alone. The danger is normalization. When destruction becomes routine, when shortages become background noise, when civilian suffering is no longer a warning sign, but an accepted condition. That is the moment when strategy quietly gives way to habit. In such conditions, the question of victory becomes secondary. What moves to the center is cost, not abstract cost, human cost. Families adjusting to instability as if it were permanent. Children growing up with uncertainty as a baseline. Entire regions learning to survive rather than to live. No political objective, regardless of how it is framed, exists in a vacuum. It is paid for in time, in health, and in lives that never appear on maps or briefings. This is why the most critical issue is not whose system is superior or whose narrative is louder. It is whether human life remains the priority or merely the currency. A war that cannot clearly define its endpoint will eventually redefine its purpose. And when that happens, civilians are no longer protected by the war's logic. They are consumed by it. If the continuation of conflict becomes safer for leadership than reconsideration, then the structure itself deserves scrutiny. Not to assign moral labels, but to ask the only question that truly matters. How long can a population be asked to endure for objectives that grow less clear with every passing month? At that point, the absence of an answer is itself an answer. And history, when it finally speaks, will not measure rhetoric. It will measure consequences.
Vai, 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 vai.